let this filthy black beggar into the halcyon to embarrass my family?
Spencer Ashford's voice boomed through the gilded carriage. With an aggressive, rapid sweep of his hand, he hurled her luggage down, sending her papers and a heavy brass stopwatch rolling across the floor. The elite crowd let out a harsh laugh. Imani Caldwell did not yell. She knelt, reaching for the stopwatch, her dead father's only memory. But a heavy, expensive heel came down, pinning her fingers against the brass on the floor. Cornelia Ashford sneered with absolute contempt.
People of your kind don't belong in this carriage. You are making a scene. Go back to the gutter where you actually belong.
Imani rose slowly, and her voice was a chilling whisper.
Take your foot off it.
Slap. The old matriarch's hand cut through the air in a sudden, violent burst of motion, striking Imani's face so hard, the ring left a blood-red line across her cheekbone. 40 billionaires watched in frozen silence. No one stepped forward. Spencer grinned, filming the humiliation for his friends. They thought she was a nobody in a plain gray coat. They had no idea this black woman was the legendary founder and chief executive of Lodestar. And with one quiet phone call from the cold vestibule between the cars, she was about to erase 3 generations of their fortune in less than 72 hours. Today, we uncover how a single act of racial contempt in a carriage of matted gold triggered the total collapse of a billion-dollar railway dynasty. If you believe that true dignity always outlasts hollow power, hit that subscribe button right now. Let us look at how the trap was set, and how the Ashford Empire lost everything because they chose to look at the window. The train was called the Halcyon, and it had been built to be a resurrection. For 3 generations, the Ashford name had meant railroads the way other names meant oil or steel or ships. It was a name laid down across half a continent in iron and gravel, and the broken backs of men whose own names history did not bother to record. Ashford Pacific had once owned more miles of track than any private company in America. There had been an era, preserved now only in the faded portraits that lined the family estate, when an Ashford could not cross the country without crossing his own land, when senators returned the family's calls within the hour, when the word Ashford on a man's card opened any door he cared to walk through. That era was gone. And it had been gone for far longer than the family permitted itself to admit. The track had been sold off in pieces across 40 years of slow decline, parcelle by parcelle, to cover the debts of an empire that had stopped building and started preserving. And an empire that preserves rather than builds is an empire that has already begun, quietly, to die. The estate remained. The portraits remained. The name remained. And the name was the single most expensive thing they owned, because it cost a fortune every year to maintain the appearance of a fortune they no longer actually had. The Halcyon was the gamble meant to reverse all of it. It was the most luxurious passenger train assembled on the continent in 50 years. 11 carriages of restored and reimagined splendor. Each one, a small museum of what money used to be able to buy. There were private staterooms paneled in figured walnut and dark exotic wood. There was a dining car where the silver was weighed by the hundredweight. There was an observation lounge under a long curved ceiling of glass, where guests could watch the whole country unscroll beneath the stars. The inaugural journey ran from the great vaulted station in Chicago, out across the plains, and up into the mountains. 3 days of engineered enchantment for a passenger list that read like the index of a book about American power. But the journey was not really about the journey. The Halcyon was a pitch. The entire glittering enterprise, the restored carriages, the curated guests, the menus designed by a chef flown in from a city across an ocean. All of it had been arranged for the benefit of a single decision that would be made by a single person, And that decision was worth more than every dollar the Ashford family had spent in the last 10 years combined. The decision concerned a thing called the Continental Corridor. It was the largest infrastructure undertaking the country had attempted in 2 generations. A national program to rebuild and modernize the spine of American rail, freight and passenger, both thousands of miles of new and reconditioned line knitting the 2 coasts together. And the operating concession for it, the right to build it and run it and profit from it for the next half-century, was about to be awarded to a single private partnership. The Ashfords had placed a bid for it. Bidding for it was, in truth, the only plan they had left, because winning would not merely restore the dynasty. Winning would become the dynasty. Reborn. There was one obstacle, and it was not a competitor. The Ashford bid could not stand on its own. The family no longer had the capital, and they no longer had the operational skill. The men who had actually known how to run a railroad were 3 generations in the ground, and what remained was a board of cousins and trustees who knew how to attend galas and sit on committees and almost nothing about steel wheels turning on steel rail. To win the corridor, the Ashfords needed an anchor. They needed a partner who could provide the capital they lacked, and, far more importantly, the operational mastery they had lost. They needed a partner whose name on the bid would transform it from a fated family's nostalgic longshot into the obvious and inevitable choice. There was exactly one such partner in the world, large enough, credible enough, and serious enough to play that role. Its name was Lodestar, and the founder of Lodestar, the woman who had built it, who controlled it, whose personal judgment alone would decide whether to anchor the Ashford bid or let it sink, was scheduled to join the Halcyon at the summit stop on the 2nd evening for a formal dinner at which the family would make their case directly, face to face, founder to founder. The most important conversation in the entire history of the modern Ashford name. The family had prepared for that dinner for 4 months. What they did not know, what no one aboard the train knew, because she had arranged it precisely so that no one would, was that the founder of Lodestar had boarded the Halcyon in Chicago. On the very first morning, 2 full days early, in a plain gray traveling coat, carrying a single, modest case, and that she had spent the entire journey so far quietly watching them. Imani Caldwell did not live the way people assumed a woman of her position lived, because most people had no idea a woman of her position existed at all. She was 44 years old, and if you had passed her in the corridor of the Halcyon, you might have noticed a certain stillness in the way she carried herself. A person who moved without hurry and without apology, who looked at things a beat longer than other people did, who seemed to be listening even when no one was speaking. But you would not have guessed what she had built, because she had spent 20 years building it specifically so that the building, and not the builder, would be the thing the world noticed. She was not a woman who filled a room with sound before she entered it. She was a woman who sat down in a corner of a room and listened until she understood it completely. And only then, if at all, did she speak. And when she spoke, the words had the quality of things that had been tested all the way through before they were let out into the air. People who had worked with her described the experience in nearly identical language. No matter how many years apart they had worked with her, you never felt handled by her. They would say, you felt considered. And the difference between those 2 things turned out to be the difference between every company she had ever touched and the ones that merely resembled them from the outside. She had not inherited a single dollar. She had grown up in a small house at the wrong end of a railroad town, in the long shadow of a switching yard, with a father who worked that yard for 31 years. His name was Eli Caldwell, and he was a signalman. He was one of the men who set the switches and read the signals and made certain that 2 trains carrying 400 lives between them did not arrive on the same length of track at the same instant. It was precise, unforgiving, essential work. And Eli Caldwell was, by the unanimous and grudging admission of every man who worked beside him, the finest who had ever done it in that yard. He could hold the entire choreography of a working junction in his head the way a chess master holds a board. 3 moves deep. In the dark. In the rain. At the end of a 14-hour shift, he was passed over for promotion to yardmaster 11 times in 31 years. He was never once given a reason, because the reason was not the kind of thing that men in that era and that place wrote down. The reason was the same reason that would hang in the air of a gilded carriage decades later. When an old woman raised her hand, the reason was his face. Eli Caldwell trained 4 different men to do the yardmaster's job. He trained them patiently, completely, holding nothing back. And he watched each of them be promoted over him. And he went home each evening to a small house where his daughter was waiting. And he did not let her see the thing the world was doing to him. Or he tried not to. But children see everything. He carried a stopwatch, a heavy brass railroad stopwatch, scuffed and dented, that he used to time the gaps between trains, and that he wound every single morning before his shift with a ritual care that his daughter, watching from the kitchen doorway, understood without being told. It was the care of a man holding on to the one small piece of the work that was indisputably, unassailably his. When he died, too early, the way men in that yard tended to die, the stopwatch came to her. She was 22 years old. With a community college degree, she had paid for herself and a job that did not use it. And she stood at the edge of the same switching yard that had spent her father's whole life telling him he was less than the men he taught. And she made herself a promise that would take her 22 more years to keep. She would build something on rails that no one could ever pass over. She started with a single distressed freight terminal, bought at auction with a loan from a small bank that very nearly did not approve it. It was a derelict yard that 2 larger companies had already written off as worthless. She did not see worthless. She saw a junction, a place where lines crossed, where freight had to change hands, where, if a person understood the choreography the way her father had understood it, value could be created out of nothing but timing and competence, and the refusal to accept that a thing was finished simply because everyone had agreed it was. She ran that terminal herself, on the ground, in steel-toed boots, for 2 years. Then she bought a second, then a logistics company to feed the terminals, then a financing arm to fund the acquisitions, then a controlling stake in a regional short-line railroad that the analysts had pronounced dead, and that she resurrected with the same patient mastery her father had brought to the yard, until the people who had pronounced it dead were quoting its turnaround in their own reports without ever wondering who had engineered it. That was Lodestar now, a private infrastructure and capital group that owned or controlled rail, ports, logistics, and the financing that moved between them, an enterprise whose total value the financial press estimated, when it bothered to estimate at all, at somewhere just north of $30 billion. And it was controlled outright by Imani Caldwell, who had never sold the thing she had built to anyone, who had never needed to, who had understood from the very beginning that the people who sell control are the people who never really wanted it, and that what she had wanted was not money, but the one thing money had been used to deny her father for 31 years, which was the final say. She kept no publicist. She declined nearly every interview. She had appeared in the financial press perhaps 4 times in 20 years, always reluctantly, always insisting that the coverage concerned the work rather than the woman, because she believed, and her board found this maddening, and her competitors found it incomprehensible, that the story of one woman who had made it out was far less important than the systems that might let 10,000 others make it out behind her. And she funded those systems quietly. There was a foundation, unnamed and unannounced, that had put more than 400 young people through trade school and college and apprenticeship in the years since she could afford it. Most of them were the children of people who worked the kind of jobs her father had worked. None of them had ever been told the name of the person who paid. She had insisted on that as a condition of every dollar. The giving was not for recognition. The giving was because she had been 22 once, standing at the edge of a switching yard with a dead man's stopwatch in her pocket. And she did not want the next one to have to stand there alone, and she carried the stopwatch still. It was in the inside pocket of the plain gray coat she wore aboard the Halcyon, because she carried it everywhere, because it was the closest thing she had to a religion, a small, heavy reminder, held against her ribs, of exactly what she was for. There was a reason she had boarded the train 2 days early, in a plain coat, telling no one, a reason her own chief of staff had argued against. Gently, the way her people had learned to argue with her, which was to state their objection clearly one time and then trust her judgment, because her judgment was the reason they had all chosen to work for her in the first place. The reason was a rule Imani Caldwell had held since the partnership that nearly ended her 20 years before. She had been young then, and the company small, and she had signed a partnership that looked flawless on paper. The right names, the right capital, the right projections, and it had collapsed within 18 months. Not because of the numbers, which had been sound, but because of the people who had not been. They had treated the men and women who actually did the work as a cost to be minimized rather than a constituency to be honored. And that single rot at the center of their character had spread outward into everything they touched until the entire structure failed. And Imani had nearly gone down with it. She had learned the lesson at a price she never forgot. And she had distilled it into a single principle she had never once broken since. You learn nothing true about people by watching how they treat you when they know who you are. You learn everything by watching how they treat the people they believe can do nothing for them. A boardroom is a performance. Every person in a boardroom is auditioning. The man who will look you in the eye and pledge his partnership across a polished table will tell you exactly what he thinks you want to hear. Because in that room he knows precisely what you are worth to him. But that same man, in a corridor, faced with a stranger in a plain coat whom he has decided is beneath his notice, that man is not performing anymore. That man is simply being. And what a person is when they believe no one important is watching is the only reliable thing you will ever know about them, because it is the only thing they are not bothering to fake. So, Imani Caldwell had developed a habit, expensive and inconvenient, and entirely her own, that the few people who knew of it found either brilliant or insane, depending on how well they understood her, before she committed lodestar to any partner of consequence, before she put her capital and her name and the labor of the people who trusted her behind another organization. She found a way to spend time among them unannounced, as an ordinary customer, as a face in a crowd, as, in this case, a quiet woman in a gray coat holding a standard ticket in a modest cabin near the rear of a train built by the very family that was, at that moment, 4 months deep in the most careful campaign of its life to win her favor. She had not told the Ashfords she would be aboard. She had told them she would join at Summit. On the second evening, for the dinner, that was true. But she would arrive at that dinner having already learned the only thing about the Ashford family that actually mattered. Not what they would say to her across a table, but who they were when they thought she was no one at all. She had not expected the answer to be delivered quite so completely, or quite so soon. It began at the platform in Chicago. beneath the great vaulted ceiling of the station, in the steam and the morning light, before the train had even moved, there was a separate boarding area for the halcyon, a velvet-roped enclosure with a uniformed attendant checking names against a leather-bound list. All of it arranged to make the passengers feel, from the very first moment, that they had crossed out of the ordinary world and into a finer one. Imani approached it the way she approached everything, without hurry, her ticket in hand, her single case beside her. The attendant at the rope was a young man with a clipboard and a carefully memorized hierarchy of deference. And he looked at Imani. He looked at the plain coat, at the single case, at her face, and something in his trained calculation reassigned her. In the space of half a second, from guest to problem, the service entrance for staff and vendors is around the far end of the platform, he said, not unkindly, but with the absolute confidence of a man who has not considered for one instant that he might be wrong. You will want to check in with the catering coordinator there. I have a ticket, Imani said. She said it without heat. She held it out. The young man looked at it the way a person looks at a thing that cannot possibly be what it appears to be. And then he looked back at her, and she watched him perform a small private negotiation between the evidence in his hand and the conclusion he had already reached. And she watched the conclusion when, the way it so often does, this will need to be verified. He said, please step aside while I locate my supervisor. We cannot have the line held up. There was no line. She stepped aside anyway. She stood beneath the vaulted ceiling and waited while a stream of other passengers flowed past her and onto the train. None of them were asked to verify anything. None of them were directed to a service entrance. All of them passed through the velvet rope on the strength of a name and a face that matched what the young man expected a guest to be. She waited 11 minutes. She knew it was 11 minutes because she timed it, the brass stopwatch warm in her closed hand inside her pocket. Its small, steady tick, the only thing in that entire station that was on her side. It was, she thought, a familiar number. Her father had been passed over 11 times. She did not believe in omens, but she noticed things when the supervisor finally came. The ticket was found to be exactly what it had always been, and there was a flurry of corrected courtesy, the particular over-warm apology of people who are sorry to have been caught rather than sorry to have done it. And Imani accepted it without comment and walked onto the halcyon and found her modest cabin. And the train pulled out of Chicago into the wide, flat country beyond. And the first day began. She spent it watching. She did not announce herself. She moved through the public carriages as any passenger might. And she observed the small grammar of the place, the way the staff moved, the way the guests moved, the gradations of attention that were paid and withheld. And it did not take her long to understand that the halcyon ran on a current of contempt, so smooth and so practiced that the people generating it were no longer even aware they were doing it at all. She watched a porter named Marcus. Because she learned the names of working people, the way the guests learned the names of wines. Marcus was an older man with 3 decades of railroad service in his careful hands, and she watched him be spoken to by a guest in a tone that no human being should ever use with another. And she watched Marcus absorb it with the trained stillness she recognized instantly from her own father's kitchen, the stillness of a man who has decided that his dignity is a thing he will keep on the inside, where it cannot be taken from him. She watched a young server be blamed for a spill she had not caused, and apologize anyway. Because apologizing was the job. Because in that carriage, the truth of who had done what mattered, far less than the comfort of the person who had paid. She watched the staff be treated as furniture that could fetch things, present when needed, invisible when not, never for one moment regarded as people who might have an interior life, a tired body, a family somewhere down the line that they were working this route to support and presiding over all of it? At the very center of the family that owned the train, she watched the Ashfords. She came to know them. Over those 2 days, the way you come to know people who do not know they are being watched, which is to say, completely. Cornelia Ashford was 74 years old, and she was the kind of woman around whom the temperature of a room dropped by a degree. She was the widow of the last Ashford who had actually run anything, and she had transmuted the loss of real power into an absolute fixation on the appearance of it. She spoke to the staff as though they were a slightly defective category of object. She corrected the placement of flowers, the temperature of soup, the angle of a steward's bow, with a relentless, icy precision that her family had long ago stopped experiencing as cruelty and started experiencing as standards. She had a particular gift, which Imani recognized as a kind of poison, for locating the one thing a person was most insecure about and touching it lightly, in passing, with a smile, so that the wound could not even be named without the wounded one seeming petty. She believed, completely and without the faintest shadow of doubt, that she and her family were a finer grade of human being than the people who served them. And she believed that this fineness was not a matter of money, because money came and went, as the Ashfords knew better than anyone, but a matter of blood, of breeding, of belonging to a category one was born into, and that no amount of mere accomplishment could ever earn one's way inside. And Spencer Ashford, 27 years old, the heir, was his grandmother's cruelty without his grandmother's discipline. Where Cornelia wounded with precision, Spencer wounded for sport. He had been raised entirely inside the bubble of the name, and of not for the name. He had never in his life worked a day that was not arranged for him. And he had developed the specific arrogance of a young man who has confused the accident of his birth with the achievement of his character. He performed his superiority loudly, for an audience, the way deeply insecure people do, and he was, beneath that performance, profoundly insecure, because some part of him knew, in the place where people keep the truths they will not look at directly, that the empire he was due to inherit was hollow, that the name was a costume, that he had personally accomplished nothing, and would be nothing at all without the inheritance he had done nothing to deserve. He could not say this to himself, so he said the opposite, constantly, to everyone, with a phone in his hand and a sneer he mistook for charm. And the cruelest thing about Spencer Ashford was that he reserved his very worst for exactly the people who could least afford to answer him back. She watched him, on the first evening, deliberately knock a tray from a young server's hands. He knocked it with a casual flick of his fingers. And then he laughed. And then he filmed the young man scrambling on the carriage floor to gather the broken glass, and posted the film somewhere with a caption she did not see but could easily imagine. And she watched the carriage of fine people watch it too, and smile, and look away, and say nothing. She made a note of it, not on paper, in the place where she kept the things that mattered, and then she watched Preston Ashford, who was the most interesting of the three, because Preston Ashford was the one part of the family that was not entirely lost. Preston was 61, Cornelia's son and Spencer's father, and he was the one carrying the actual weight of the gamble. He was the one who knew, in detail, exactly how much the family had leveraged, exactly how thin the margin was, exactly what would happen if the corridor bid failed. He was tired in a way the others were not, because he was the only one who truly understood. He was not a cruel man. Not in the active way his mother and his son were cruel, but he was a weak one. Weak in the specific way of a man who knows that something around him is wrong and chooses, again and again, not to see it, because seeing it would cost him too much. He had watched his mother humiliate the staff for years and called it her standards. He had watched his son curdle into something monstrous and called it youth. He had built his whole adult life on the foundational decision not to look directly at the rot in his own house. And that decision, Imani understood, was its own kind of complicity. The quiet, comfortable, well-dressed complicity of the man who could have stepped between the matriarch and the stranger, and chose, instead, to study the middle distance. By the second morning, Imani Caldwell had learned everything she needed to know about whether Lodestar would anchor the Ashford bid for the Continental Corridor. The answer was no. She had not yet decided how she would deliver that answer. She was, by deep temperament, a person who did not act in anger, who did not make a scene, who believed that the most powerful response to contempt was to remain exactly herself and let the contempt account for itself in time. She had thought she would simply attend the dinner at Summit, hear the family's pitch with the courtesy she extended to everyone, and decline, quietly, finally, completely, and then let the consequences unfold on their own. She had not planned on the gilded carriage. She had not planned on the matriarch's ring. But the second evening was still hours away. And the halcyon was climbing now, out of the plains and into the first foothills of the mountains. And Imani Caldwell went forward, in her plain gray coat, toward the dining carriage, where a hand was waiting to rise into the lamplight and teach her, one more time, the lesson her father had spent 31 years learning, and where, this time, the lesson was about to be returned. The dining carriage of the halcyon was the most beautiful of the 11. And at the hour, Imani entered it. It was full. The dinner service had not yet begun, but the carriage had filled with guests gathering for the cocktail hour that preceded it. And the Ashfords held court at the center of the car. At the long captain's table beneath the finest of the chandeliers, Cornelia sat at its head, like a figure carved from winter. Spencer sat beside her with his phone, and his small entourage of young men who laughed at his jokes because their families also had names. Preston sat a little apart, half listening to a banker, his eyes tired. The string trio played in the lounge beyond. Champagne moved through the room on silver trays, carried by staff who had been instructed. Imani had learned to keep their eyes lowered and their movements small. She had come forward for a simple reason. Her cabin was near the rear, and the only path to the observation lounge, where she had intended to spend the evening watching the mountains rise, ran the length of this carriage. She had not come to confront anyone. She had come to walk through a train car. That was all it had ever been. She had taken perhaps 4 steps into the carriage when Spencer Ashford saw her. He saw the plain gray coat first, the way the attendant in Chicago had seen it, and the carriage's whole apparatus of contempt clicked on in him, the way it had clicked on in the young man at the velvet rope, except that Spencer did not have even the young man's instinct toward politeness. Spencer had an audience, and a stranger had wandered into his theater, and a stranger who did not belong was, to Spencer, not a person, but an opportunity. His voice boomed across the carriage, loud enough that every conversation stopped at once. Who let this filthy black beggar into the halcyon to embarrass my family? A few of his companions laughed. Imani kept walking. She did not slow down, and she did not speed up. She simply continued toward the far door at the unbroken pace of a woman crossing a room she had every right to cross. Which was the response? She had learned over a lifetime that men like Spencer found the most intolerable of all, not anger, which they could feed on, but the simple refusal to grant that their performance had landed. It enraged him. She watched it enrage him. She watched him register that she had not flinched, and watched him decide to escalate. Because for a man like Spencer Ashford, A stranger's composure was a challenge that could not be allowed to stand in front of the people whose opinion was the only thing holding his hollow self together. He stepped into her path. "I am talking to you," he said, and the carriage was paying close attention now. The conversation's thinning. The way a room goes quiet when it senses something forming. "This is a private car. Did you not understand that? Do you understand what I am saying to you?" He spoke slowly. The way a certain kind of person speaks to someone they have decided is beneath their language as well as their station. And that, more than anything he had said, was the thing that told Imani everything. She had heard that exact cadence before. Her father had heard it for 31 years. It was the sound of a man who had decided, on the evidence of a face, that the person in front of him was not merely an intruder, but a lesser order of being. Slow, simple, in need of small words. "I understand you perfectly," Imani said. Her voice was level and unhurried and entirely calm. "I am a passenger on this train, and I am passing through to the observation car. Excuse me." She moved to step around him, and Spencer Ashford, with an aggressive, rapid sweep of his hand, hurled her case to the floor. It struck the inlaid wood and came open, and its contents spilled out across the carriage floor, at the feet of 40 of the most powerful people in the country. A few papers, a folded scarf, a small leather folio, and a heavy brass stopwatch that came loose and rolled in a slow arc across the polished floor toward the captain's table. The carriage laughed. Not all of it, but enough that the sound of it filled the space. The bright, cruel laughter of comfortable people watching someone smaller be made smaller. And Spencer turned to his audience and gave a small bow, accepting it. And somebody said, "Oh, the poor thing," in the tone people use when they mean the precise opposite. And Imani knelt down on the floor of the dining carriage in her plain gray coat to gather her things, while above her the laughter went on. She gathered the papers. She gathered the scarf and the folio, and she reached for the stopwatch, which had come to rest near the foot of the captain's table. Near the hem of Cornelia Ashford's gown, she reached for the one object in the world that was her father. That was 31 years of swallowed dignity. That was the entire reason she had built everything she had ever built. And a heavy, expensive heel came down, not beside it, on her fingers, pinning her hand against the brass on the floor. She looked up. Cornelia Ashford was looking down at her with an expression of such complete and untroubled disdain that it did not even rise to the level of hatred. Hatred would have been a kind of acknowledgement. This was lower than hatred. This was the look one gives a thing. "People of your kind do not belong in this carriage," Cornelia said, in her quiet, carrying voice, while her heel rested on Imani's fingers. "You are making a scene. Go back to the gutter where you actually belong." "That stopwatch belonged to my father," Imani said. She said it quietly. "Please, take your foot off it." Something in the simplicity of it should have reached anyone. It was the most human possible sentence. It was a daughter asking for a piece of her father, and Imani watched it not reach Cornelia Ashford at all. She watched it slide off the old woman's certainty like rain off glass. And in that moment, she understood, with total clarity, that she was not dealing with a person who had made a mistake about who she was. She was dealing with a person for whom the who did not matter. Who would have done this to anyone wearing this coat with this face? Who had done a version of it to 1,000 people across a long life? Who experienced her own cruelty, not as cruelty, but as the natural and correct ordering of the world? Imani rose to her feet. She rose slowly, and she stood at her full height in front of the old woman. And she did not raise her voice. And she said it again. And this time, it was not a request. "Take your foot off it." And that was the moment Cornelia Ashford's hand came up. It happened the way these things always happen. Too fast to stop, and slow enough to remember forever. The old woman's hand rose into the lamplight, the rings catching the gold of the chandelier, and came down across Imani Caldwell's face in a sudden, violent burst of motion. It struck her so hard that her head snapped to the side, and the sound of it rang through the entire carriage. And the ring left a thin, blood-red line across her cheekbone. The string trio in the lounge beyond faltered on a half-played note and went silent. "People of your kind," Cornelia said again, into the ringing silence, "do not belong in this carriage." And the carriage froze. This is the part Imani would think about later. Not the slap, but the freeze. The slap was one cruel old woman, and the slap could be understood. It was the freeze that told the truth about the room. 40 people, bankers, and heirs, and the directors of museums and foundations, people of education and influence and self regarding decency, people who would all, every one of them, have described themselves without hesitation as good, and not one of them moved. Preston Ashford, 8 feet away, looked at the window. The banker beside him studied his drink. Spencer lifted his phone and filmed his grandmother's verdict with a grin, capturing it, preserving it, sending it out into the world as a thing to be enjoyed. Somewhere, a woman laughed, her small, approving laugh, and the rest of them performed the great communal act of that kind of room, which is to arrange themselves so completely around their own comfort that the suffering at the center of it ceases, for them, to be occurring at all. Imani stood with her face turned by the blow and a thin line of heat rising on her cheekbone where the ring had caught it. And she did not cry out, and she did not stagger, and she did not raise her own hand. Though her own hand could have ended Cornelia Ashford's evening in a single motion, and her body, for one white instant, wanted to. She held it. She had held larger things than this. She turned her head slowly back to face the old woman. And she looked at her. She looked at her, the way you look at something you are committing to memory. And the carriage waited to see her break. Because a room like that always wants the person at the center of it to break. Because breaking would confirm the story they had all silently agreed upon. The story in which she was small. And they were right. She did not break. She bent down, calmly, and she lifted Cornelia Ashford's ankle aside with 2 fingers. The way you move an obstacle. And she picked up her father's stopwatch from the floor of the dining carriage and held it in her closed hand against her chest. And she straightened. And she looked at the 40 silent witnesses arranged so carefully around their discomfort. And then she looked back at Cornelia. And the only thing she said was this: "Thank you." It was not sarcasm. That was the strange thing. The thing that troubled the few who were close enough to hear it. In the days that followed, when they tried to describe the moment to people who had not been there, it did not sound like sarcasm. It sounded like a woman who had just been handed a piece of information she had genuinely been waiting for, and who was, sincerely, in her own grave way, grateful to have received it at last. Then she turned and walked the rest of the length of the carriage, unhurried, her head level, her father's stopwatch in her hand, and she passed through the far door into the vestibule between the cars, and the door closed behind her, and the dining carriage of the Halcyon slowly returned to its evening. The trio resumed. The champagne moved. Spencer narrated the encounter to his laughing companions. Cornelia settled back into her chair with the small, satisfied composure of a woman who had just restored the correct order of things. They had no idea what had just walked out of the room. In the vestibule between the cars, where the cold mountain air came through the joints in the steel and the rails sang their endless double note beneath her feet, Imani Caldwell stood for a moment with her back against the wall and her father's stopwatch held in both hands. And she let herself feel it. She believed in feeling things. She had learned, over a long life of being underestimated, that the people who pretend they are not hurt are the people who eventually break in some hidden way. At some later time, over some unrelated thing, and that the way to remain whole was not to deny the wound, but to hold it, fully, consciously, and then to decide, deliberately, with a clear head, what to do with the energy it released. So she stood in the cold vestibule, and she felt the indignity of it, the sharp public shame of having been struck and laughed at, the particular and specific loneliness of being harmed in a room full of people who chose not to see the way you can be at the exact center of a crowd and entirely, completely alone. She felt the heat on her cheekbone. She felt the ache of her father and the brass beneath her thumbs. 31 years. 11 promotions. 4 men trained, and 4 men promoted over him. A whole life of this exact thing. This exact silence. This exact room. And then, the way she always did, she felt the feeling change its shape in her hands and become something else. It became clarity. She was not angry. Or rather, the anger had passed through her and out the other side, and left behind it the thing she trusted far more than anger, which was certainty. She had come aboard the Halcyon with a question, and the question had been a serious one, deserving of 2 days of patient observation. And she had told herself she would reserve judgment until she had all of it. She did not need to reserve judgment anymore. The carriage had answered. The matriarch's ring had answered. The 40 silent witnesses had answered. The boy with the phone had answered. She had her answer now. Complete and final. And the strange grace of it, the thing she had meant when she said thank you, was that the family had shown her the truth of themselves so completely, so unmistakably, that she would never again have to wonder. She took out her phone. She did not call her lawyers. She did not call her board. She did not, in that moment, do any of the large machinery of things that she could have set in motion, and that she would, in time, set in motion. She made one call, to one person, her chief of staff, a woman named Renata, who had been with her for 15 years, and who answered on the second ring, because she always answered on the second ring. "It is me," Imani said. "I have made my decision about the corridor." There was a pause on the line. Renata knew exactly where she was. Renata had argued, gently, against her going 2 days early in a plain coat. And Renata had been overruled. And Renata was far too good at her job to say, "I told you that something would happen." Because something happening was dull. After all, the entire point. "All right," Renata said. "Tell me what you need." Imani Caldwell looked out the vestibule window at the mountains rising blue and black against the last of the light. And she told her exactly what she needed, in a voice as calm and level as the one she had used to ask the old woman to take her foot off the stopwatch. And as she spoke, the machinery that the Ashford family had spent 4 months and the last of their fortune trying to set in their own favor began, instead, very quietly, to turn against them. Then she put the phone away, and she walked to the observation car, and she watched the mountains, and she waited for Summit. The Halcyon reached Summit at dusk on the second evening, climbing the last of the grade and easing into the small mountain station where it would pause for 2 hours before the final overnight run to the coast. Summit was the centerpiece of the journey, the jewel of the entire itinerary. A restored grand station house at the top of the world, all timber and stone and tall windows full of alpenglow, where the inaugural passengers would disembark for a formal dinner in a private hall. The Ashfords had reserved entire, and it was here, at this dinner, that the family had planned the most important conversation in 3 generations, the moment they would make their case, face to face, to the founder of Lodestar, and secure the anchor that would win them the Continental Corridor and resurrect the dynasty. They had prepared for it down to the smallest detail. The hall had been dressed. The chef had built the evening's menu around it. Preston had rehearsed his presentation a dozen times. The history of the family, the vision for the corridor, the case for partnership. Every word weighed and measured. Cornelia had selected her jewels for it. Even Spencer had been made to understand, in the only language he respected, that the founder of Lodestar was the one person aboard the train to whom the family's entire future would be addressed, and that he was to be, for one evening, on his very best behavior. They had been told the founder would join them at Summit. They had not been told the founder's name. This was not unusual. Lodestar was famously private, and the family's contacts had dealt for months with intermediaries, with Renata, with the apparatus that surrounds a person of that level. The Ashfords knew only that the founder was a self-made figure of formidable reputation, that the founder's operational record in rail was without equal, and that the founder's decision was the whole game. They had built a 4-month campaign, and a luxury train, and an entire evening, around a person they had never met and could not picture. They had, in fact, met that person. They simply did not know it yet. The guests gathered in the lamplit hall as the mountain sky went from violet to deep blue beyond the tall windows. The Ashfords stood near the entrance to receive their pivotal guest. Cornelia regal in her chosen jewels, Preston in his finest dark suit, with the full weight of the evening on his shoulders, Spencer scrubbed and suited and impatient. His phone, for once, in his pocket. A string quartet played. The hall held its breath, in the way a room holds its breath when everyone in it knows that something decisive is about to arrive. At 7 o'clock precisely, a motorcade arrived at the station house. It came up the mountain road in the dusk. Not a single car, but a column of them, dark and quiet and serious. The kind of arrival that announces, before a single door has opened, that the person at its center is of an order entirely different from anyone present. The guests in the hall turned toward the tall windows. The Ashfords moved forward. The doors of the station house opened, and a delegation entered. Lawyers, executives, 2 senior members of the federal authority that governed the corridor concession, and at their head, a woman who had been with the founder for 15 years, who entered the way a herald enters, clearing the path, and who said, in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the suddenly silent hall, "Ladies and gentlemen, the founder of Lodestar has arrived." And the door behind the delegation opened, and Imani Caldwell walked into the hall. She had changed out of the plain gray coat. She wore, now, a long column of deep slate blue, understated in cut and exceptional in fabric. The kind of garment that does not announce its cost because it does not need to, and on a fine chain at her wrist, she wore her father's brass stopwatch, where anyone close enough could see it, because she had decided that tonight, of all nights, it would be visible. There was a thin, fading line still on her cheekbone, lightly covered, where a ring had caught her the evening before. She walked into the center of the hall with the same unhurried composure with which she had walked the length of the dining carriage, and the federal officials walked beside her, and the lawyers walked behind her, and she stopped in the center of the room and looked out at the gathered guests, at the 40 witnesses, at the bankers and the heirs, at the woman who had laughed, and then she turned, without haste, to face the family that had come forward to receive the founder of Lodestar. She watched it land. She watched it land on Spencer first. Because Spencer was young and his face had not yet learned to lie quickly. She watched the grin he had prepared for a self-made stranger. He intended to charm, collapse into confusion, and the confusion curdle into recognition, and the recognition open into a horror so complete that he physically stepped backward, one hand rising halfway to his mouth, as the full architecture of the previous evening reassembled itself in his mind around a single unbearable fact, that the woman whose case he had hurled to the floor, whose father's stopwatch he had sent rolling across the carriage, whose humiliation he had filmed and posted for his laughing friends, was the person his family's entire future depended upon. Was the founder? Was, and had been the whole time, the one human being on Earth he should never have touched. She watched it land on Preston next. And Preston's was the worst to watch. Because Preston understood the fastest and the most completely. Preston knew, to the dollar, what the family had leveraged. Preston knew that there was no plan beyond this one. That the bid could not stand without Lodestar. That everything, the estate, the name, the 3 generations, had been bet on this woman's yes. And Preston had stood 8 feet away the night before and looked at the window. Imani watched the color leave his face entirely. She watched him grip the back of a chair. She watched a man feel the floor of his entire life give way beneath him in the space of a single second. And she made herself feel honestly, because she did not believe in lying to herself, even in victory. Not satisfaction. Exactly. But the grave settling weight of something true finally being seen by the person who had most needed to see it, and she watched it land. Last, on Cornelia, the old woman did not step back. The old woman did not grip a chair. Cornelia Ashford stood at her full regal height in her chosen jewels and looked at the woman she had struck across the face 19 hours earlier. And Imani watched her understand. And watched her understanding war with 74 years of certainty that such an understanding could not possibly be correct. That the order of the world simply did not permit the woman in the gray coat to be the woman the world bowed to. And she watched the certainty lose. Finally, at last, all at once. The way a great structure loses its footing, not gradually, but in a single, irreversible instant. And for the first time in the entire journey, for the first time, perhaps in many years, something moved in Cornelia Ashford's face that was not contempt. It was fear. The hall was silent. The quartet had stopped. 40 people stood frozen in a configuration that was the exact mirror image of the configuration in the dining carriage the night before. The same room. The same people. The same silence. Except that the center of it had moved. The person at the center of that silence was no longer a stranger in a gray coat to be made small. The person at the center was the one with all of the power in the room, and every soul in that hall had just been forced to understand that they had watched her be struck, and had said nothing, and that she had seen them not say it. Imani Caldwell let the silence hold for a moment. She was not performing. She had simply learned, long ago, that there are moments whose meaning is carried by their stillness, and that to rush them is to waste them. Then she spoke, and her voice was calm and clear, and it carried to every corner of the hall. "My name is Imani Caldwell," she said. "I founded Lodestar 22 years ago. Before that, I ran a freight terminal. Before that, I grew up at the edge of a switching yard, where my father set the signals for 31 years, and was passed over for the work he had earned 11 times. For a reason no one in this room needs me to explain." She lifted her wrist, slightly, so that the brass stopwatch caught the lamplight. This was his, she said. He timed the trains with it. Last night, a member of this family hurled it onto the floor of your beautiful dining car, and another member of this family put her heel on my hand, and then struck me across the face. And 40 of you watched, and not one of you moved. She paused. I want you to sit with that. I am not going to raise my voice about it. I am simply going to ask you to remember, for the rest of your lives, that you were given a chance, last night, in a railway carriage, to be the kind of person who steps forward, and that every one of you, every single one, chose instead to study the window. No one spoke. No one could. I came aboard this train, she went on, to learn one thing, and one thing only. Not what you would say to me across a dinner table tonight. I already knew you would say all the right things tonight. You have been rehearsing them for 4 months. I came to learn what you are when you believe that no one important is watching, because that is the only thing about a person that is ever actually true. She looked, for a moment, at Preston, and then at Cornelia, and then at Spencer, and then back out at the room. And now I know. She turned to the 2 federal officials standing beside her, and to the lawyers behind them, and the formal machinery of the evening. The machinery the Ashfords had built for their own triumph began, in front of all of them, to deliver the exact opposite. She did not shout. She did not gloat. She did the far more devastating thing, which was to be precise. She informed the 2 federal officials, in front of the entire hall, that Lodestar would not be anchoring the Ashford bid for the Continental Corridor. She told them that after careful evaluation, she had concluded the Ashford organization did not meet the standard of character that Lodestar required of any partner, a standard that was written, word for word, into the operating principles of her firm, and that she had never before had occasion to invoke quite so directly. She said it plainly. She said it the way a person reads a verdict that has already been reached in the only court that mattered, which was the court of what these people actually were. And everyone in that hall who understood what they had just heard, understood, in the same instant, exactly what it meant. It meant the end, because the Ashford bid had never been able to stand without Lodestar, and the family had leveraged nearly everything they still controlled against the certainty of winning. Within 72 hours, the consequences began to arrive, and they arrived the way consequences arrive for an empire built on appearance rather than substance. All at once, from every direction, faster than anyone could possibly answer, the corridor concession, deprived of its anchor, was awarded elsewhere, and the markets, which had been pricing Ashford holdings on the assumption of a win, repriced them overnight on the certainty of a loss. The leverage the family had taken on came due. Creditors who had extended themselves on the strength of the bid called their loans. The relaunch that the Halcyon was meant to herald collapsed before the train had even completed its inaugural run. The partners who had been circling, sensing prestige, scattered, now sensing blood. The estate went on to the market. The portraits came down off the walls. The name, the most expensive thing the family owned, became, in the space of a single season, a liability rather than an asset, a thing whispered about in the very rooms where it had once opened every door. The empire that 3 generations had spent 40 years preserving rather than building finally bore the weight it had been quietly accumulating all along. And it bore it the way such structures always do, which is to say, not at all. And it did not stop at the family's fortune, the film Spencer Ashford had made, his grandmother's hand rising into the lamplight. The verdict, the words about who did and did not belong in that carriage, had been posted by Spencer himself, that first night, as a thing to be enjoyed by his laughing friends. And it had spread, the way such things spread, far beyond the small audience he had intended. By the time the country understood who the woman in the gray coat had been, the film was everywhere. And it was no longer a joke. It was evidence. It was a 74-year-old heiress striking a self-made woman across the face on a luxury train. Narrated and circulated by the very heir who had hurled her father's stopwatch onto the floor. There was no spinning it. There was no name large enough to absorb it. Cornelia Ashford was charged with assault. The film made it unanswerable. And the witnesses, 40 of whom had said nothing at all in the moment, found their memories sharpening considerably once there was a camera on the other side of the question. She was convicted. A woman who had spent 74 years certain that the order of the world placed her above consequence learned, late and completely, that it did not, and she lived out her diminished remainder in a smaller house under a heavier name. And the jewels she had chosen for the most important evening of her family's life were sold, with everything else, to people who did not care in the slightest whose they had been. Spencer Ashford lost everything that had ever been arranged for him, which was everything he had, because he had never built anything of his own. The inheritance that was to have been his evaporated with the empire, and the film that he had made for his friends became the first thing anyone learned about him for the rest of his life. The single defining fact of him, attached to his name in every room he would ever enter. The young heir who had filmed his own grandmother striking the woman who held his family's future. He had wanted, more than anything in the world, to be seen as superior. He would be seen, instead, forever, as exactly what he had revealed himself to be on the floor of that dining carriage. And he would never be able to take it back, because he had filmed it himself. This was the part Imani Caldwell took no satisfaction in. And she made herself look at it honestly, because she did not believe in pretending to a virtue. She did not possess any more than she believed in pretending to an injury. She did not feel. The goal had never been to destroy the Ashfords. The goal had been to protect something, the thing she had spent 22 years building, the capital, and the name, and the labor of the people who trusted her, to protect it from the corrosive influence of people who did not understand that power was not the same as character, that money was not the same as integrity, and that the confidence to strike a stranger across the face in a carriage full of witnesses was not strength, but its exact and precise opposite. She had not needed to destroy them. She had only needed to step back and decline to hold up a structure that had been leaning, all along, on a foundation it had not earned and could not keep. The empire collapsed under its own accumulated weight. She had simply stopped being the thing it was leaning on, but she did something else, too. And this was the part that mattered most to her. The part she had decided upon in the cold vestibule between the cars with her father's stopwatch in her hands. And it was the part that made the difference between mere downfall and something that would outlast all of them. She did not simply walk away from the Continental Corridor. She rebuilt it, using Lodestar's capital and operational mastery. Imani Caldwell assembled a different bid for the next phase of the National Rail Program, and she built into the very bones of it everything that the Ashford version of American power had been constructed to prevent. She established, as a binding condition of the concession, a procurement standard that opened the contracts to firms that had spent generations being passed over, the way her father had been passed over, a transparent, auditable standard, with no quiet gradations of who belongs, no vavatropes, no service entrances for the people the old order had decided were a lesser grade. She wrote a conduct standard into every vendor agreement, plainly worded, that bound every partner in the enterprise to treat the people who actually did the work as a constituency to be honored rather than a resource to be used. A dignity clause, the press came to call it. though Imani never called it anything but the obvious. And at the center of it, she built the thing she had been quietly building all her life. Only now in the open. And at scale. An apprenticeship program. Tens of thousands of positions across the rebuilt national rail network. That took young people from exactly the kind of railroad town she had grown up in. The children of signalmen and porters and the men and women the old order had rendered invisible, and it trained them. Completely. Holding nothing back. In the actual mastery of the thing. The choreography of steel on steel. And then it promoted them. On merit. With no one's foot on anyone's stopwatch, she named it the Eli Caldwell Program. It was the only time in her life she ever attached her family's name to anything publicly, and she did it because her father had spent 31 years training the men who were promoted over him. And she had decided that his name would belong, from now on, to a system that promoted the people he himself would have trained. The first cohort numbered 400. She insisted on that number. It was the number of young people her unnamed foundation had quietly put through school over 20 years. And it was, though she never once said this to anyone, 11 times larger than the 40 witnesses who had studied the window, and she had a private feeling, which she did not examine too closely, that the arithmetic was not an accident. There was one more thing she did, in the weeks after the collapse, that never made the business pages, because it was not the kind of thing the business pages knew how to see. When the Ashford Empire came apart, the Halcyon came apart with it. The train was seized and sold and broken into its separate carriages, scattered among buyers who wanted a paneled dining car for a hotel lobby or a stateroom for a museum. And the people who had worked that train, the porters and the servers and the stewards who had been treated as furniture that could fetch things, they were the ones who stood to lose first. And most. The way working people always do when an empire built above their heads finally falls, because the people at the top have estates to sell, and the people at the bottom have only the next shift. Imani Caldwell knew this. She had grown up in it. She knew that the surest sign of an empire's contempt was that its collapse landed hardest on exactly the people who had kept it running, and who had never once been thanked for it. So she found them, all of them. She had Renata pull the full employment record of the Halcyon. Every name. And she made certain that every porter and server and steward who had worked that train was offered a place in the new enterprise. Not as a gesture, not as charity, but at better wages. And with real advancement, in a company where their work would be treated as the thing the entire venture stood on, rather than the thing it stood over. Marcus, the porter with 3 decades of careful service in his hands, the man she had watched absorb a guest's contempt with her own father's exact stillness, became a senior trainer in the Eli Caldwell Program, teaching the young ones the craft and the dignity of the work in equal measure. And on the first morning of his new position, he was handed, by a quiet woman in a plain coat who did not stay to be thanked, a brass railroad stopwatch of his own. She did not see the Ashfords again. There was no reconciling meeting in a neutral office. No quiet private apology accepted across a small table. And that absence was deliberate, and it was hers. Preston Ashford did, in the months that followed, attempt through intermediaries to arrange an audience, to say the things that people in his position say once the consequences have finally arrived. And Imani Caldwell considered the request with the seriousness she brought to every decision. And she declined it, not out of cruelty, out of a clear-eyed understanding that she owed him nothing, that the conversation he wanted was a conversation for his benefit and not for hers, a chance to feel that the matter had been resolved with dignity, and she had no obligation to provide him that comfort, and a great many better things to do with the hours of her life. She had given the room its closure already. In the hall its summit. In front of everyone. In the only words that mattered, you were given a chance to step forward. And you chose to study the window. There was nothing to add. The conversation was complete. She let it stay complete. She returned to the work, the way she always returned to the work. Because the work was the answer to every question she had ever been asked about whether she belonged in the room. A year later, she stood at the back of a plain hall in a railroad town. Not a grand station house at the top of a mountain, but a working depot beside a working yard. And she watched the first 400 graduates of the Eli Caldwell program receive their certifications. There were no chandeliers. There was no quartet. There was a freight line running behind the building. And the young people crossing the small stage were the sons and daughters of people who set signals and carried bags and had spent their whole lives being told, in 1,000 quiet ways, that the gilded carriages of the country were not for them. Imani did not speak at the ceremony. She did not need to. She stood at the back in a plain coat, the way she preferred, with her father's stopwatch warm against her ribs, and she watched them cross the stage, and she wound the stopwatch once, the way he had wound it every single morning of his life, and she let it run, she thought, watching them, about the dining carriage, about the slap, which had lasted 1 second, and the frieze, which she would carry forever. She had felt all of it. She had held it, and she had converted it, with the patience of a lifetime spent being underestimated, into a system that would take 400 young people this year, and 400 the next, and 400 the year after that, and promote them on the very merit the old order had spent 3 generations denying. And she understood, with the particular clarity that comes to a person who has been told their whole life that they do not belong, and has answered by building until the room is theirs, that this was the only revenge that had ever interested her, not the family's ruin, which had come and gone and meant nothing. This, the stopwatch, running, the next ones, not standing at the edge of the yard alone, the gilded carriage would become, in time, a story, a thing taught in business schools, an illustration that professors would use to make a point about the hidden costs of contempt, about character and consequence, and the foundations that empires forget they are standing upon. Imani Caldwell would not be the one to tell it. She never told it. She did not need to. The facts had their own momentum. And she had learned long ago that the most powerful thing a person can do in a world that underestimates them is not to fight the underestimation, but to outlast it, to build something so plainly, so undeniably real, that eventually even the people who most want to dismiss it cannot find the language to do so. And the woman who had been struck across the face in a railway carriage in front of 40 silent witnesses was the same woman who had built a $30 billion enterprise from a single derelict freight yard and a dead man's stopwatch, which meant that she had already known, long before she ever boarded the Halcyon, the only thing she had ever really needed to know about how things begin, and what they can become, and who, in the end, decides. She walked out of the depot into the afternoon light, where a freight train was working, the yard her father might have recognized, and she had a meeting in the morning she was looking forward to. There were things to build. There were always things to build. So here is the question the story leaves behind. In the carriage, for anyone still sitting in it, a country can build the most beautiful train in 50 years. Paneled in walnut, weighed in silver, gilded from end to end. But if it builds that train on a foundation of deciding, by the look of a person's face, who is permitted to ride in it and who must use the service entrance, Then how long? Really? Before the whole magnificent thing bears a weight it was never built to carry, and goes the way of every empire that ever mistook the appearance of grandeur for the substance of it. And the harder question, the one meant for you, and not for them. The next time a hand rises in a quiet room, and you feel the whole space silently agree to look at the window, will you be one more careful study of the middle distance? Or will you be the one who steps forward? 40 people had the chance to step forward in that carriage, and not one of them took it. So I want to hear from you. Be honest. In that room, would you have been the one to stand up? Or the one studying the window? Imani never once raised her voice. Do you believe that calm dignity is a stronger answer to contempt than rage? Or does staying silent let them win too easily? And if you have ever been judged before you were given a chance, the way Eli Caldwell was judged for 31 years, tell your story below. Someone reading this needs to know that they are not standing at the edge of that yard alone. If this story moved you, if you believe that true dignity outlasts hollow power, subscribe and stay with us, because the next story is one you will not want to miss.